Good morning. The first sermon I ever preached was after my first year in seminary, when the congregation that Cynthia grew up in West Bend, Iowa, asked me to preach there in the summer of 1967. I had just completed a course on the prophet Amos, and I have a few comments from that sermon. As you heard, Amos was preaching to the church in Samaria, the northern kingdom. It was a time of peace, which they mistook as a sign of God's favor, rather than an invitation to do God's work. His theme was a question: who is the God of history? The prophet is asking the Israelites specifically, who do you suppose led your enemies to their homeland? It's important to remember all of our history and all of its implications, and to do it rightly. This is the theme of our presentation this morning. I would like now to turn it over to Cynthia, who is the historian in our family and our travel guide.
Good morning. 4 years ago, we planned a trip to various Civil War sites in Alabama because of our American history interests related to racial and human rights issues. As individuals living in northern states, we felt we were observers to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and we wanted to learn more about several southern locations that gained national attention. In Birmingham, Alabama, a city that was a stronghold of segregation and civil rights activism, we toured the Civil Rights Institute. Opening in 1992, the Institute is an interpretive museum and research center that tells the story of the struggle of the civil rights movement in Birmingham. Its galleries feature a rendition of a segregated city of the 1950s, a replica of the Freedom Riders bus, and the actual jail door from behind which Dr. Martin Luther King wrote his famous letter from the Birmingham jail. The Institute also teaches that, quote, the silence and indifference to the suffering of others can perpetuate social problems and division, close quote. Across the street from the Institute is the 16th Street Baptist Church. Founded in 1873 as the first Black church in Birmingham, it has served as a worship and social center for the African American community. By the early 1960s, the church provided space for civil rights rallies that led to marches and demonstrations. Tragically, the church experienced a horrific bombing in 1963 that caused the death of 4 young girls who were attending Sunday school classes. This tragedy led to expressions of sympathy and financial contributions from around the world to restore the damaged building. A memorial plaque honors the girls. Close to the Institute and the church is the Kelly Ingram Park that served as a starting point for a march by teenagers to protest segregation injustices. A violent confrontation between the marchers and the Birmingham police in this location shocked the nation as we watched on television. Today, the park features sculptures depicting this struggle and offers a quiet and peaceful place to remember the Civil War conflicts in Birmingham. In Montgomery, a city 90 miles south of Birmingham, the Civil Rights Memorial honors those who died participating in the movement from 1954 to 1968. Sponsored by the Southern Poverty Law Center, it is also today a location for education and reflection about the contest for equality. Nearby the memorial is the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church. It is here that its pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association that launched the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was also organized in this church, and Dr. King's ministry gained national attention. Close to Dexter Avenue is the Freedom Rides Museum, located in Montgomery's historic Green Greyhound bus station. In 1961, an integrated group of 21 college students from Nashville arrived here to nonviolently protest the practice of segregated travel in the South. These students became known as the Freedom Riders, and their actions changed the city and our country. Related to the Montgomery bus boycott is the Rosa Parks Museum. Its exhibits and artifacts tell us of the arrest of Rosa Parks after she refused to give up her seat because of her race on a Montgomery city bus. It also features other people's activities that challenged the political and social climates of Montgomery in the 1950s. 54 miles west of Montgomery is Selma. In March 1965, this rural community received national attention for its planned walk to Montgomery in pursuit of securing voting rights for African Americans. The first attempt by 600 individuals to march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery was met with violent attacks on them at the Edmund Pettus Bridge by Alabama state troopers. Again, a nation witnessed the horror of this assault, and President Lyndon Johnson federalized 1,900 Alabama National Guard troops and other military personnel to protect marchers for another walk to Montgomery. On March 21st, over 4,000 participants left Selma for Montgomery. As they progressed to Montgomery, the number of individuals increased to 25,000 people, including Dr. King, and a young John Lewis, who would later serve in Congress. In the aftermath of this march, the Voting Rights Act was signed by President Johnson in August 1965. Today, Selma has a number of sites that commemorate these events. They include the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a pivotal location of this march, the Selma Interpretive Center that provides a context for the development, and the Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church, a staging point for the march to Montgomery. In between Selma and Montgomery, the Lowndes Interpretive Center shares significant information about the march and the creation of Tent City, which housed families dislodged by white landowners in Lowndes County.
I'm going to invite you now to take a bit broader view of our racial history in the West. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the Doctrine of Discovery. It ratified all European claims of conquest. It provided a blanket moral authority for all of those claims of superiority by white Europeans over anyone else. It gave Christian explorers the authority to in the name of their sovereign, to invade and dominate, to claim possession of the properties and resources of people, all the people that they discovered, and enslave them if they were not Christian. And if they met resistance, to kill them in God's name. God is not the author of this history. This doctrine remains written in United States law. In the 1823 Supreme Court decision, Johnson versus McIntosh, and it has never been repealed. It has justified slavery. It has been used to justify forcing Native Americans to accept treaties that deprived them of their homelands. Excuse me, I'm in speech therapy for that. It allowed breaking treaties with Native Americans at will. I was born on the Standing Rock Reservation, 7 miles from where Sitting Bull was assassinated. I remember my dad going away just a few miles north of our farm to fight a prairie fire alongside our Dakota Sioux neighbors. In the 1950s, we left that place and moved to the family homestead where my great-grandparents lived. Land which in the 1860s had been stolen by treaty from the Dakota Sioux to be resold to the railroad companies for resale to European immigrants, my great-grandparents among them. Now, another history lesson. This will unsettle one of our American myths. The pilgrims did not come here to eat pumpkin pie with the Native Americans, but to steal their pumpkins, to steal their pumpkin patches, and then to enslave them, to cultivate, to plant, and harvest pilgrim crops. The pilgrims, after all, had been bankrolled by wealthy investors. They expected a return on their investment. In his Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967, which Cynthia and I were privileged to hear in person, Dr. King linked his quest for the fight for racial equality to the quest to end the Vietnam War. All people are equal in the eyes of God was the principle that he was following. In closing, I will offer these verses which I wrote to summarize my understanding of Dr. King's teachings. Peace. It's beyond our grasp. It will never be achieved in full. Yet, it is in the striving that we find it. We may see it on the horizon. We may glimpse it from the mountaintop. We may travel in its direction, but we will never quite reach it. Let there be an awakening of an agitation of heart within us that stirs us to devote our lives to live a vision of peace that when it takes hold of us, troubles us to strive for it. We need this restlessness of spirit to be planted deep in our souls, to hitch our wagons to it, to lead us to walk by the streams that flow toward justice and the ever-flowing rivers of righteousness. Amen. I wrote this prayer nearly 20 years ago as our country was gearing up the war in Afghanistan. O God, make the old ones fight. If war we must, make the old ones fight. Let the minimum age be about 60, so that our warriors may bring to the battlefield, a healthy measure of reluctance that reveals respect for death's finality. If war we must, send the bankers to count the cost of loss to families at gravesides mourning children fallen and lying cold, unresponsive to their parents' longing to put their arms around them one more time. If war we must, Send the lawyers who parse the law to justify irrational acts and calculate advantage. Let them offer arguments to prove that good is bad and bad is good before a shot is fired. Then let them stand in front of bullets to unleash their furious reasoning. If war we must, send the wealthy in their prime to peer over foxhole edges, to calculate lives lost in battlefields in relation to gains in territory or power, like points lost in Wall Street bartering. It's time to see real blood flowing, not spreadsheets bleeding red. If war we must, send the crowd that bellies up to the bar on Friday night after a week's work is done, to cheer the troops with shots and jeer at those who long for peace. Let them raise their glass on battlefields instead. Let beer-inspired courage and alcohol's bravado argue the patriot's dream in front of flying lead. If war we must, let truth be told about its cost to pious politicians smugly convinced that we must fight and kill. Let us suffer no romantic illusions of glory or of fame. May fear bring sobriety and reveal it's the devil's work that makes children killing children seem acceptable.